May 10th, 1940. The German army crosses into Belgium and Luxembourg at dawn, and within hours something happens that military planners across Europe cannot explain. The Wehrmacht doesn't slow down. It doesn't stop to rest, to regroup, to eat. It moves, continuously, relentlessly, at a pace that defies every calculation about how long a human body can sustain combat operations. French commanders, watching the advance on their maps, keep waiting for the pause that never comes. Their own doctrine said an army needed rest. This one didn't seem to. 3 days into the campaign, German armoured columns are already threading through the Ardennes forest, terrain that Allied strategists had confidently declared impassable for tanks, not because of the trees, because of the time. Moving an armoured force through the Ardennes was supposed to take at minimum 9 days. The Germans did it in 3. The soldiers manning those vehicles had not slept. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Not 1 or 2 days without sleep. 3. Some units logged 4. Field medics attached to panzer divisions recorded soldiers who had been awake for 96 hours, still performing mechanical repairs on tank treads, still reading maps, still firing weapons with accuracy. One regimental surgeon wrote in his field notes that the men seemed to have somehow disconnected from their own exhaustion. That fear, too, appeared to have been switched off. He used the German word enthemmt, uninhibited, freed from restraint. What he didn't write, because he already knew, because everyone already knew, was why. In the weeks before the French campaign launched, the German military had distributed approximately 200,000 tablets to the soldiers of Army Group A alone. Small, white, slightly chalky pills stamped with the Temmler Pharmaceutical logo. The men called them by several names: Panzerschokolade, Tank Chocolate, Stuka Tabletten, Stuka Tablets, named after the dive bomber, Hermann Göring Pillen, a sardonic nod to the Luftwaffe chief known for his own pharmaceutical appetites. Whatever soldiers called them, they swallowed them the same way, before a push, before a night march, before anything that required a human being to exceed what a human being could do. The pill's real name was Pervitin. Its chemical name was methamphetamine, the same molecule. In 1940 alone, Temmler Pharma's Berlin factory produced over 35 million Pervitin tablets, a significant portion of which flowed directly into Wehrmacht supply chains. These were not black market pills smuggled in through the back of a truck. They were manufactured, packaged, labelled, and shipped as standard military rations, listed alongside food and ammunition in quartermaster logs. A soldier in a panzer division received his Pervitin the same way he received his bread. It came from the government. It had a recommended dosage. The box had a red stripe. France fell in 46 days. Military historians have spent decades analysing that campaign, the audacity of the Ardennes route, the failure of French intelligence, the brilliance of Erich von Manstein's plan. These things were real. They mattered. But embedded inside that story, rarely printed in the same paragraph as the troop movements and tactical decisions, is a biochemical fact that changes the shape of everything. The German soldiers who executed that plan were operating on methamphetamine, distributed by their own government, manufactured by a pharmaceutical company that had been selling the same pill to housewives in Berlin for 2 years. The fall of France wasn't only a military event, it was in part a pharmacological one. And the people who authorized it, the generals, the physicians, the company directors, were not monsters operating in secret. They were not rogue actors. They were functioning inside a system that had decided, after careful consideration and clinical trials, that this was a good idea, a reasonable idea, a modern idea. The science was sound, the results were measurable, and the soldiers weren't complaining. That is what makes this story harder to look away from. Because Pervitin didn't begin in a weapons lab. It didn't begin with a general looking for an edge. It began the way most catastrophic things begin, with a scientist trying to help people in a world that desperately wanted to be helped, at a moment when the difference between a miracle and a disaster looked like nothing more than a very small white pill. The question is not how a drug that powerful ended up in the hands of a military. The question is how it got there so quietly, so cleanly, so completely, welcomed at every step by doctors, generals, and governments who believed they understood what they were holding. They didn't. And the man who first synthesized it, working in a Berlin laboratory in 1937, had no idea what he'd just started. Berlin, 1937. The city smelled of ambition and construction dust. New buildings were going up along the Unter den Linden. The Olympic Stadium from the previous year still drew visitors, and the newspapers ran stories about German efficiency, German strength, German will. The Reich was 6 years old and already behaving as though it had always existed. Inside this atmosphere, competitive, accelerating, obsessed with performance, a chemist named Friedrich Hauschild went to work every morning at the Temmler pharmaceutical plant on Johannisthaler Chaussee and asked himself a question that, on its surface, seemed entirely reasonable. Could a pill make a tired person feel like they hadn't slept at all? Hauschild was not a radical. He was a careful, methodical organic chemist with a doctorate and a practical orientation, the kind of scientist who filled notebooks in a small, precise hand and cross-referenced his results 3 times before writing a conclusion. He was not working on a weapon. He was working on a product. Temmler was a mid-sized pharmaceutical company with a decent catalogue and a constant commercial pressure to find the next profitable compound. Depression was widespread in Germany after the economic devastation of the Weimar years. Fatigue was near universal among the working class. If someone could synthesize a molecule that reliably lifted mood and eliminated tiredness, the market would be enormous. Hauschild knew about amphetamine. Everyone in pharmaceutical circles did by 1937. The American company Smith, Klein and French had been selling a product called Benzedrine since 1934, an amphetamine inhaler originally marketed for nasal congestion that users had discovered produced a powerful stimulant effect. Soldiers, students, and truck drivers in the United States were already using it. British researchers were studying it. The Japanese had their own version, called Philopon, derived from a methamphetamine synthesis, first performed by a chemist named Nagai Nagayoshi back in 1893 and refined by Akira Ogata in 1919. The molecule had been sitting in the scientific literature for nearly 2 decades, largely ignored, waiting for someone to realize what it could do at scale. Hauschild realized it. His key insight was not the synthesis itself. That existed. His contribution was recognizing that methamphetamine, the slightly modified version of a regular amphetamine, crossed the blood-brain barrier faster and more completely than its predecessor. The effect was stronger. It hit sooner. It lasted longer. Where Benzedrine might sharpen a tired person's focus for a few hours, Hauschild's compound did something closer to resetting the brain's experience of fatigue entirely, not masking it, but temporarily convincing the brain that it wasn't there. He named it Pervitin. Temmler filed the patent in 1937. The early clinical trials were conducted quietly, with the measured optimism that characterized legitimate pharmaceutical research of the era. Test subjects, volunteers mostly, reported feeling alert, confident, energetic. Their performance on cognitive tasks improved measurably. Several subjects described a sense of clarity they hadn't felt in years, the world becoming more manageable, problems shrinking to their actual size rather than the inflated scale that exhaustion and anxiety give them. One trial report noted that subjects showed markedly reduced hesitation when making decisions. That particular detail would matter later, enormously. But in 1937, it was filed as a positive result. What Hauschild and Temler were working within was not a culture of recklessness. It was a culture of genuine scientific optimism about what chemistry could do for the human body. The 1930s were the decade of sulfonamides, the first antibiotics, the early days of hormone research. Doctors were watching chemistry solve problems that had seemed permanent. Tuberculosis was retreating. Surgical survival rates were climbing. The idea that a molecule could simply fix something broken in human physiology, including the broken feeling of exhaustion and despair, did not seem outlandish. It seemed like the next logical step. Temler launched Pervitin to the German public in 1938. The marketing was direct and confident. Advertisements ran in medical journals and popular magazines alike, describing Pervitin as suitable for depression, fatigue, low mood, and difficulty concentrating. One promotional pamphlet distributed to physicians described it as producing a lasting improvement in mood and an increase in performance. The recommended dose was 1 to 2 tablets daily. The pamphlet made no mention of dependency. There was no section on discontinuation. The word addiction appeared nowhere in the material. It sold extraordinarily well. Within months of launch, Pervitin was available in virtually every pharmacy in Germany without a prescription, sitting on the same shelf as aspirin and cough medicine. Chocolates containing a therapeutic dose of Pervitin, manufactured by the Hildebrand Chocolate Company, appeared in confectionery shops. A product called Mutterwitze, roughly translated as mother's wit, combined Pervitin with other compounds and was specifically marketed to women managing households and children. The pill had moved in less than a year from a clinical trial to a candy shop. Nobody in the regulatory structure of the Reich paused on that trajectory long enough to ask what it meant, and Friedrich Hauschild, whose small, precise handwriting filled those early trial notebooks, whose careful methodology had produced a genuinely effective compound. He watched his molecule enter the world and saw what everyone around him saw: a success, a product that worked, a contribution to the health of the nation. What he could not see, what no one in 1938 could see, or perhaps more accurately, what no one in 1938 was looking for, was what happened after the clarity faded. What the brain felt when the dopamine the drug had forcibly released was gone and nothing remained to replace it. What a person did the next morning, and the morning after that, when the only way to feel like themselves again was to swallow another small white pill. That question had an answer. It just hadn't been asked yet. But in a military research office in Berlin, a doctor named Otto Ranke had read the Temler trial data and was already thinking about something else entirely. Otto Ranke was not the kind of man who got excited easily. He was a military physician, trained to read data without flinching, accustomed to the bureaucratic restraint that military medicine demanded. But when he read the Temler trial results in early 1939, something shifted in his thinking, not emotionally but structurally. He saw a different set of numbers than Temler's marketing department had seen. Where they saw a product for tired housewives, Ranke saw a solution to the oldest problem in warfare. The human body needed sleep. An army did not want to. Every military commander in history had faced the same wall. Soldiers who had been awake for 20 hours made worse decisions, moved slower, flinched when they should have advanced. Sleep deprivation was not a weakness of character. It was a biological ceiling, and every army in the world operated beneath it. Ranke believed Pervitin could raise that ceiling, possibly eliminate it altogether, for short critical periods. He designed a study to find out. In the spring of 1939, Ranke tested Pervitin on 90 medical students at the Academy of Military Medicine in Berlin. The conditions were controlled, the methodology sound by the standards of the time. Students were given standard cognitive tasks, map reading, calculation, reaction time tests, first without the drug, then after doses of Pervitin at varying intervals during sleep deprivation. The results were, by any measure, striking. Performance degradation under sleep deprivation was dramatically reduced. Students who had been awake for 24 hours and given Pervitin outperformed rested students who had received nothing. Ranke wrote his conclusions in a memo to Wehrmacht High Command that spring. The memo was 11 pages. Its central claim occupied one sentence. With Pervitin, it might be possible for a German soldier to remain combat effective for 3 to 4 days without sleep. Ranke was careful. He noted that further study was needed. He flagged the need for dosage discipline. He acknowledged that the come-down period required rest and monitoring. These qualifications were present in the document. They were also, in the way of military bureaucracies confronted with a compelling capability, read past. What the generals took from Ranke's memo was the sentence, not the qualifications. The timing was not coincidental. By the summer of 1939, German military planning for the invasion of Poland was in its final stages. Wehrmacht strategists were designing a campaign built on speed, overwhelming, disorienting, continuous speed, a form of warfare that would later be called blitzkrieg, but that its architects understood simply as the aggressive exploitation of momentum before an opponent could organize a response. Pervitin fit that doctrine the way a key fits a lock it was made for. Poland, September 1939. The first military use of Pervitin at scale. Supply was not yet systematic. Distribution happened unevenly, unit by unit, with some commanders embracing it and others ignoring it. But enough tablets moved through enough hands to produce observable results and, crucially, observable demand. Soldiers who had taken it wanted more. Soldiers who hadn't heard about it from soldiers who had. Field physicians began requesting larger supplies. The feedback loop between battlefield use and military procurement opened, and it opened fast. Back in Germany, the civilian market was accelerating along its own track. By late 1939, an estimated 1 in 4 Berlin households contained Pervitin. The pharmacies on Kurfürstendamm restocked it twice a week. Factory managers in the Ruhr industrial belt were buying it in bulk for night shift workers, some paying out of their own budgets before the practice became semi-official. University students across Germany had discovered that Pervitin compressed study time in a way that felt, at least for the first several weeks, entirely sustainable. A student at the University of Munich reportedly completed his dissertation in 11 days during a Pervitin run that his roommates later recalled as involving no sleep at all between Wednesday and Sunday. No one in any official capacity called this a problem. Then there was Heinrich Böll. In 1939, Böll was 21 years old, newly conscripted, stationed first in the Reich Labour Service, and then moved into the Wehrmacht as the war machinery accelerated. He was slight, literary, uncomfortable with military life in ways he couldn't fully articulate. A young man who read poetry when he could, and wrote letters home that were longer and more carefully constructed than those of most soldiers his age. His parents kept every letter. His mother tied them in bundles by month. Böll's early letters from 1939 mention Pervitin the way a person mentions coffee, as a practical, unremarkable tool for managing an uncomfortable situation. He asks his parents to send him tablets with the same matter-of-fact tone he uses when requesting warm socks. One letter from October 1939 notes that the tablets were easier to come by at his previous posting and harder to find at his current one, and that this was proving inconvenient. He doesn't explain why he needs them. He assumes his parents understand. They sent them. His mother packed Pervitin tablets into the same parcels as homemade biscuits and a small photograph of the family dog. The parcels arrived with Wehrmacht postal markings and were inspected at the field post office like every other package. No flags, no restrictions, because there was nothing to flag. Pervitin was legal, available, and in the process of becoming so embedded in the daily functioning of the German military that its absence, in some units, would have been more notable than its presence. Böll was not an addict in 1939. He was a tired young man in an army that had given him a chemical solution to tiredness, and he used it the way the army implicitly encouraged him to use it, without much thought, and without any particular concern about what came next. That was the design. Not malicious design, not a conspiracy. Just the natural consequence of distributing a powerfully addictive stimulant to millions of people without telling them what it was. Somewhere in that same autumn, in a Wehrmacht medical supply office, someone signed a procurement order for a new shipment of Pervitin to be pre-positioned for a coming campaign in the West. The quantity was larger than anything ordered for Poland. Significantly larger. Otto Ranker had been consulted on the dosage protocols for that campaign. He had provided recommendations, specific, carefully calculated recommendations about timing and quantity. He had also, in a separate document that went to a different desk, noted something his Poland-era diar was beginning to suggest, that repeated use over consecutive days produced diminishing returns, requiring higher doses for the same effect. That document appears to have gone unread. The procurement order was filled. To understand what Pervitin did, it helps to understand what the brain does without it. The human brain runs on a system of chemical signals, neurotransmitters, moving between neurons like messages passed hand to hand across a very long room. One of the most important of these is dopamine. It governs motivation, pleasure, focus, and the feeling that effort is worth making. When dopamine is flowing at normal levels, the world feels manageable. Tasks feel completable. A tired soldier can still find a reason to move. A tired mother can still find a reason to get up. Methamphetamine does not gently encourage dopamine production. It kicks the door open. Within minutes of ingestion, Pervitin forces the brain to release dopamine at roughly 12 times its normal rate, simultaneously flooding the synapses and blocking the mechanism that would ordinarily reabsorb and recycle it. The result is not just wakefulness. It is a complete biochemical reorganization of how the brain experiences the present moment. Fear signals are suppressed. Fatigue signals are overridden. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for hesitation, risk assessment, and the recognition of danger, is functionally dampened. What remains is pure, unfiltered forward momentum. This is what the soldiers in the Ardennes felt. Not courage, not willpower, not the triumph of ideology or training, or the famous German military discipline that historians would later cite. What they felt was the chemical absence of the mechanisms that would have otherwise made them stop. The fear was still theoretically there, in the same way a fire alarm is still technically present after someone has cut the wire. The body had the capacity for exhaustion. The brain had simply been instructed by a molecule to ignore the signal, for 3 days, sometimes 4. Heinrich Böll, writing from a posting in France in mid-1940, described the sensation in a letter home with the careful precision of a man who would later become one of Germany's finest writers. He didn't name Pervitin in that particular letter. Censors read the post, and soldiers had developed a light code for it, referring to tablets generically. But the experience he described was unmistakable. A feeling of the world becoming very clear, very fast and very close, as though everything that had previously seemed complicated had been compressed into something simple and immediate. He wrote that on certain days he felt he could see the shape of a problem before it fully formed. He wrote this at 3 a.m. He was not tired. Now consider Elsa Mertens. 34 years old, living in a 4th-floor apartment in the Prenzlauer Berg district of Berlin, mother of 2 boys aged 8 and 5. Her husband Karl had been conscripted in September 1939 and was somewhere in France by spring 1940. She received his letters irregularly, knew almost nothing about where he was or what he was doing, and managed the household, the children's schooling, the ration cards, the queue at the butcher on Tuesdays, and the persistent low-grade anxiety of a woman whose husband was at war entirely on her own. Her doctor prescribed Pervitin in March 1940. The diagnosis recorded in his notes was nervous exhaustion with depressive features, a catch-all category that covered in practice most of what women in Elsa's situation were experiencing. The prescription was standard by 1940. Pervitin had become the default response to that particular set of symptoms among Berlin physicians, the way a doctor today might reach for an antidepressant. It wasn't recklessness on the doctor's part. It was, by the evidence then available, reasonable medicine. Elsa took her first tablet on a Wednesday morning in March, after dropping the boys at school. By noon, the apartment was clean in a way it hadn't been in months. Not just tidied, but scrubbed, organised. The boys' winter coats sorted by size and folded into the storage chest she'd been meaning to address since November. She cooked a full meal for dinner. She wrote Karl a letter that ran to 4 pages, covering their eldest son's reading progress, a neighbour's new baby, a small repair needed on the kitchen window latch. She went to bed at 11 and lay awake until 2, mind moving too fast to stop, and felt, when she finally slept, that it had been one of the most productive days she could remember. She thought, this is what I was supposed to feel like all along. That thought, precise, specific, entirely understandable, was the most dangerous thing Pervitin produced. Not the wakefulness, not the energy. The conviction that the medicated state was the correct state, and that everything before it had been a deficit. Doctors across Germany were observing the same pattern without yet having a framework to interpret it. Patients returned for repeat prescriptions with a consistency that stood out even in busy urban practices. Some physicians noted that patients who had previously been unremarkable, coming in once or twice a year for routine issues, were now appearing monthly, sometimes more often, specifically to request Pervitin. A physician in Hamburg wrote in his practice log in late 1940 that he had begun to notice patients becoming, in his word, insistent when he suggested they try a lower dose or take a week's break. He prescribed them more anyway. There was a war on. This was not the moment to add to people's burdens. The Temler literature remained consistent on the key point that made all of this possible. Pervitin was described as non-habit forming. This was not a lie born from corruption or cynicism, at least not initially. It was a reflection of what the available short-term trial data suggested, read through the lens of a pharmaceutical industry that did not yet possess the neurochemical understanding to know what habit forming actually meant at the cellular level. The concept of physical dependency as a measurable, predictable biochemical process, the brain downregulating its own dopamine receptors in response to chronic overstimulation, requiring more of the drug just to reach baseline, was not yet established science. Hauschild hadn't known. Ranker hadn't known. Elsa's doctor hadn't known. The brain knew. It had already started adjusting. For Elsa, the first sign came 6 weeks in. She had taken her usual morning tablet, but the day felt slower than it should. The apartment larger, the tasks more numerous. She took a second tablet in the early afternoon. The box said 1 to 2 daily, so she was within the stated range. The afternoon improved. She filed this away as useful information. 2 tablets, not 1, for harder days. In France, Heinrich Böll was making the same calculation, expressed differently. His request to his parents had shifted from occasional to regular, and the quantity mentioned had doubled. His letters remained articulate, thoughtful, full of literary observation. But between the lines of a letter dated June 1940, in a passage describing the French countryside, there was a single sentence about waking at 4 a.m. with a feeling he couldn't name. Not fear, not sadness, something more physical, a kind of interior darkness that lifted only after he'd taken a tablet. He described it as though it were weather. Neither Böll nor Elsa knew the other existed. They had nothing in common except a shared dependence on the same molecule, sourced from the same factory, authorized by the same government, sold as the same solution to 2 entirely different problems. And in Wehrmacht medical supply chains, the orders for the next campaign's Pervitin allocation were already being processed, quantities that dwarfed everything ordered before. The crash was coming. For the soldiers, for the housewives, for the entire architecture of normalcy that had been built around a pill whose most important property had never once appeared in any of its promotional materials. What that crash looked like, the first time the system was forced to see it, was already being written in a field surgeon's notebook somewhere east of the Rhine. He was counting bodies. The first deaths were easy to miss. That was the problem. A soldier found in his bunk. No visible wounds, no signs of combat trauma. Heart simply stopped. Another collapsed during a routine march, dead before the medic reached him. A third was found slumped against the wheel of a supply vehicle in a French village, a half-eaten piece of bread still in his hand. Each death, reviewed individually, produced a different administrative explanation. Heart defect, previously undetected, heat exhaustion, unknown cause, wartime conditions. The paperwork was filed. The column moved on. But a field surgeon attached to the 12th Army Corps had begun keeping a second notebook. His name does not appear in most histories of this period. His official reports went up the chain in the standard format, generating standard responses. His second notebook was personal, dense, cramped entries written after his official duties were done, recording the pattern he was seeing that the official format had no category for. Soldiers dying without wounds, young men physically fit by induction standards, cardiovascular systems failing under conditions that should not have killed them. He began noting next to each entry whether the deceased had been documented as a Pervitin user. By autumn 1940, his second notebook had 14 names. In Berlin, a different kind of alarm was sounding, quieter, bureaucratic, but real. Dr. Leo Conti, the Reich health leader, had been receiving reports from civilian physicians about a pattern of concerning behaviour in Pervitin users. Patients requesting prescriptions with escalating urgency. Patients who became irritable and non-functional when supplies ran short. Patients presenting with symptoms that older doctors, the ones who'd been practicing long enough to have seen morphine dependency in the years after the First War, were beginning to recognise. Conti was not a sympathetic figure by any measure. He was a committed ideologue who had done serious harm through other policies. But on Pervitin, his instinct was medically correct. He commissioned a review in mid-1940 and received back something that should have stopped the programme entirely. The review, compiled by pharmacologists at the Reich Health Office, concluded that Pervitin produced measurable physical dependency within weeks of regular use. It described the withdrawal syndrome in clinical terms: severe fatigue, depressive episodes, inability to experience normal pleasure, intense craving for the drug. It noted that the brain's own dopamine system was being fundamentally altered by chronic use, suppressed, restructured, made incapable of functioning normally without chemical assistance. The report recommended immediate restriction of Pervitin to prescription-only status and a formal investigation into military distribution practices. The report was dated October 1940. Conti moved to implement its recommendations. Pervitin was reclassified under the Reich Opium Law in November 1940, requiring a prescription for civilian purchase. It was a real regulatory action. Pharmacies enforced it, physicians were notified, and civilian access was genuinely reduced. For anyone watching only the civilian side of the story, it looked like the system had worked. A problem had been identified, a response had been issued, the damage was being controlled. What the civilian restriction did not touch was the military supply chain, not by one tablet. The Wehrmacht's Pervitin procurement operated through a completely separate logistics infrastructure, exempt from the civilian pharmaceutical regulations that Conti's office controlled. The same week that Berlin pharmacies began requiring prescriptions, Wehrmacht quartermasters were processing orders for the Eastern Front build-up, a campaign the High Command was already planning, a campaign that would require soldiers to perform in the Russian winter what they had performed in the French summer. The military didn't need Conti's permission. It had its own supply. It had Temmler's direct contract. And Temmler was producing more than ever. Here is where the first twist lands, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet administrative fact that changes the shape of everything preceding it. The Wehrmacht High Command had received Conti's review, not a summary, not a second-hand account, the actual document, forwarded through official channels as part of the standard interagency information sharing that the Reich's bureaucracy maintained. The generals read a report concluding that their drug produced physical dependency, damaged the brain's chemistry, and was killing soldiers with cardiac failure. They continued distribution. The decision was not made in secret. It was made in a staff meeting, weighed against operational requirements, and resolved in favour of operational requirements. The minutes of that meeting no longer exist. What exists is the procurement record, the order placed, the quantity approved, the signature at the bottom of the page, which tells the story more precisely than any minutes could. In the field, the second notebook kept filling. A new entry, winter 1940. A soldier in a rear supply unit had been awake for 6 days on a self-administered Pervitin regimen, exceeding any sanctioned dose protocol by a factor of 3. On the 7th day, he attacked 2 members of his own unit with a field shovel, believing, according to witness accounts gathered afterward, that they were Soviet infiltrators. They were not. One survived. The soldier was subdued, sedated, and transferred to a military psychiatric facility. His file listed the cause as combat fatigue with acute psychotic episode. The words Pervitin and overdose did not appear in the file. This was not an isolated incident. Across Wehrmacht medical records from late 1940 and early 1941, there is a pattern of psychotic breaks, paranoid episodes, and extreme violent behaviour in soldiers who had been using Pervitin for extended consecutive periods. Events consistently filed under combat fatigue, nervous breakdown, or unspecified psychiatric disturbance. The drug was never named as a contributing factor in any official military medical record from this period. That absence was not accidental. Naming Pervitin as the cause would have required the military to acknowledge that its officially sanctioned stimulant program was producing soldiers who couldn't distinguish their own comrades from the enemy. It would have required them to confront the field surgeon's second notebook, the Reich Health Office report, and the growing pile of death certificates for young men with healthy bodies and stopped hearts. They named it combat fatigue instead. For Elsa Mertens, the civilian prescription law arrived too late to mean much. Her doctor, under the new rules, could still prescribe Pervitin. He simply had to write it down now, which he did, on the first visit and every subsequent one. The prescription pad created a paper record that hadn't existed before. It did not create a ceiling. Elsa's dose had been climbing quietly for months, and her doctor, seeing a woman who appeared functional, who kept her apartment clean and her children in school and her letters to her husband regular, had no framework for recognizing what that functionality was costing. She picked up her prescription every 3 weeks, then every 2. 300 kilometers to the east, on a training ground outside Warsaw, Heinrich Böll was preparing to move with his unit toward an assignment he hadn't been told the details of yet. His letters home in early 1941 were shorter than before, more factual, less literary. He mentioned the cold. He mentioned the food. He asked at the end of one letter, almost as a postscript, whether his parents had been able to get more tablets, because the supply at his posting had become unreliable, and the days without them were difficult in a way he didn't elaborate on. His mother read that sentence 3 times. She understood something her son hadn't directly said. She packed the next parcel immediately and took it to the post office before noon. Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, and the scale of it made France look like a rehearsal. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers, the largest military invasion in human history. The distances involved were unlike anything the Wehrmacht had previously encountered. France was a country you could cross in days. The Soviet Union swallowed armies whole and kept going. The supply lines stretched until they frayed. The winters arrived earlier and harder than the planning documents had accounted for. And the Pervitin, which had worked so cleanly in the compressed, fast-moving geometry of the Western campaign, began encountering the one condition its chemistry had no answer for: a war that didn't end. The drug's fundamental mechanism, forcing the brain to spend dopamine reserves it hadn't yet produced, worked brilliantly for short, intense bursts of demand. 3 days in the Ardennes, a rapid advance across northern France, a single night march of extraordinary length. These were the conditions Rank had designed his study around, and the drug had delivered exactly what the study promised. But the Eastern Front was not a 3-day problem. It was a 3-year problem, then a 4-year problem, in temperatures that dropped to -40 in January, and terrain that turned roads into mud channels in autumn and frozen ruts in winter, against an opponent who did not collapse the way France had collapsed. Soldiers who had used Pervitin for weeks now needed it just to reach baseline. The tolerance problem, which Ranke had flagged in that secondary document, the one that went unread, was now a field reality on a continental scale. A soldier in the first weeks of Barbarossa who took a standard 3 mg tablet felt the original effect. Clarity, energy, suppression of fear, and fatigue. A soldier who had been using it for 3 months needed 6 milligrams for a diminished version of that effect. By 6 months, some soldiers were taking 10-12 milligrams, quantities that produced not the clean focus of the early doses, but something more jagged and unreliable, a state where the stimulation outpaced the cognitive control it was supposed to enhance. At those doses, the paranoia began. It didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in through the edges of perception, a heightened vigilance that was useful in combat but didn't switch off when combat ended, an inability to trust the stillness of a quiet moment, a tendency to interpret ambiguous information as threat. Soldiers described it, when they described it at all, as a feeling of being watched from just outside their field of vision. Some stopped sleeping even when ordered to, not because they were energized, but because lying down in the dark felt, at certain doses, genuinely terrifying. Heinrich Böll's letters from the Eastern Front tell this progression in miniature. The letters of early 1942 are factual, clipped, stripped of the literary observation that had characterized his earlier writing. He reports weather and rations and troop movements in the abbreviated language of someone conserving something, attention, or perhaps the energy required to feel things fully. A letter from February 1942, written from somewhere outside Kharkov, mentions that he's been awake for a long time, does not specify how long, and that the cold has reached a temperature he had previously believed incompatible with human activity. He notes this not with drama, but with the flat effect of a man whose emotional register has been significantly narrowed. One letter, undated, contains a single sentence that his biographers would later spend considerable time with. He writes that he has begun to see things at the edge of his vision that are not there when he turns to look. He does not mention Pervitin in that letter. He doesn't need to. His supply from home had become less reliable as the postal system strained under wartime conditions, and the military distribution, always uneven on the Eastern Front, had thinned in his sector. The days when parcels didn't arrive and military supply ran short had their own texture, a heaviness, a slowing, a sense that the world had become suddenly and inexplicably difficult to navigate. He was 23 years old. He had been using methamphetamine at escalating doses for approximately 2 years. Elsa Mertens, in her Prenzlauer Berg apartment, was experiencing a parallel deterioration on a slower timeline. By 1942, the prescription had been rewritten 4 times at increasing doses. Her doctor remained untroubled by this. Elsa presented well at appointments, dressed appropriately, answered questions coherently, and showed none of the obvious signs that the medical literature of the time associated with drug problems, which were mostly drawn from observations of morphine and heroin users and didn't map neatly onto a woman who cleaned her apartment and got her children to school. What her doctor couldn't see was what happened between appointments, the mornings when the tablet wore off around 2 p.m, and the remaining hours until bedtime felt geological in their slowness, the increasing difficulty of feeling anything, satisfaction, affection, ordinary pleasure, without the drug's assistance. Her younger son had stopped bringing friends home from school. He couldn't explain why exactly. Something about the apartment felt different in the afternoons. The civilian black market for Pervitin had expanded dramatically after the 1941 prescription law, supplied through a network of pharmacists, hospital workers, and military personnel rotating home on leave with surplus tablets. Elsa's neighbour, a woman whose brother worked in a Wehrmacht supply depot outside Berlin, had access to this network. The arrangement was informal, conducted in the stairwell, payment in cash or ration coupons. Elsa had first used it in late 1941 when her prescription ran out a week early. By 1943 she was using it regularly to supplement what her doctor provided, the 2 streams together barely maintaining what she had come to understand as functional. Now consider what was happening simultaneously 12 time zones away. Japan's military had reached the same conclusion as Germany's, through different channels and with characteristically different scale. Philipon, the Japanese methamphetamine, had been distributed to military pilots, soldiers and factory workers since the late 1930s. By 1943, the Japanese government had essentially abandoned any pretense of medical oversight and was distributing amphetamines as a standard military resource, the way other armies distributed food or ammunition. Kamikaze pilots received it before missions. Factory workers on munitions lines received it as part of their shift allocation. The Japanese term for the drug, hirapon, had entered the language as casually as the word for rice. The quantities were staggering. In the final year of the Pacific War, Japanese military and industrial distribution of amphetamines exceeded 35 million doses. The workforce running Japan's war machine was, by the final stages of the conflict, operating in a state of chronic methamphetamine dependency that its government had deliberately engineered and showed no interest in addressing. Back in Germany, a Wehrmacht medical officer named Doctor. Gerhard Orzechowski had begun, in late 1942, to do what the field surgeon with the second notebook had started doing 2 years earlier, but with more resources, more access, and a more systematic approach. Orzechowski was stationed at a military hospital outside Minsk, rotating casualties through a facility that was seeing, by 1943, not just the physical wounds of the Eastern Front, but its psychological wreckage. He had a particular interest in what the military was calling combat fatigue, the category that covered psychotic breaks, paranoid episodes, extreme behavioral disturbances, and the constellation of symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as stimulant psychosis and withdrawal. He had begun requesting medical histories from field units, cross-referencing casualty reports with supply records, mapping Pervitin distribution against the incidence of behavioral and cardiac events in the same units over the same periods. The correlation was not subtle. Units with the highest documented Pervitin distribution showed a 340% higher rate of combat fatigue psychiatric admissions than units with lower distribution, controlling for combat intensity. Cardiac deaths among soldiers under 30 in high distribution units ran at nearly twice the rate of comparable units. The data wasn't perfect. Field records were incomplete, supply documentation was inconsistent, and the category definitions were loose enough to allow significant misclassification. But as a directional signal, pointing from one thing to another with unmistakable force, it was as clear as data from a war zone could reasonably be. Orzechowski compiled his findings into a formal report through the winter of 1943. He was methodical, careful to note the limitations of his data, precise in his language. He did not editorialize. He presented numbers and let them speak. The report was finished in November 1943. He submitted it through the standard Wehrmacht medical reporting channel, addressed to the Army Medical Inspectorate in Berlin. He received an acknowledgement of receipt 14 days later, a form letter, the kind sent automatically. After that, nothing. No response, no follow-up inquiry, no request for additional data, no notification that the report had been reviewed or acted upon. Orzechowski waited through December. He sent a follow-up inquiry in January 1944. The reply he received told him the matter was being reviewed by the appropriate authority. He would not learn, until after the war, what that authority actually was, or what it had already been doing with Pervitin for the past 2 years, not distributing it to soldiers, but testing it on people who had no choice at all about whether they swallowed the pill. Orzechowski's report had not been filed and forgotten, it had been redirected. The Army Medical Inspectorate in Berlin had received it, noted its subject matter, and forwarded it, not upward through the standard Wehrmacht medical hierarchy, but sideways to a different office entirely. An office that had developed, over the preceding 2 years, a specific and operational interest in exactly the questions Orzechowski was asking. How much Pervitin could a human body absorb before it failed? How long could a person function under extreme physical stress while chemically stimulated? And at what precise point did the drug stop extending human endurance and begin destroying it? The office was the SS, and the reason it could answer those questions with data that no pharmaceutical trial had ever generated was that it had been running its own experiments, not on volunteers, not on medical students in a Berlin laboratory, but on prisoners at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, 35 kilometers north of the city where Friedrich Hauschild had first synthesized the molecule 6 years earlier. The experiments had begun in 1942 under the administrative designation of Sea Rescue Research, a classification that described, with bureaucratic precision, almost nothing about what actually happened. The stated purpose was to determine how long a downed pilot or shipwrecked sailor could survive extreme physical exertion under emergency conditions. The practical reality was a series of endurance trials in which prisoners were forced to walk a circular track inside the camp, wearing military-grade boots loaded with weighted insoles for as long as they could be kept moving. They were given Pervitin. The doses administered were not the 3 mg civilian tablets sold in Berlin pharmacies. They were experimental doses, escalating doses, quantities calibrated not to optimize performance, but to measure the outer edge of what the drug could force a human body to do before that body gave out entirely. Prisoners walked for days. The SS doctors recorded everything: pace, duration, physical deterioration, time of collapse, cause of death where applicable. The data was meticulous. The filing was careful. The results were submitted to the same pharmaceutical research infrastructure that Temler fed into, where they sat alongside the clean clinical trial data from 1937, as though the two sets of numbers had been generated by equivalent methods. At least 200 prisoners died in documented Pervitin-related experiments at Sachsenhausen. The actual number is likely higher. Documentation from the camp's medical block was partially destroyed in the final weeks of the war, and the record-keeping conventions used for prisoner deaths did not require the specificity that would have made a complete count possible from surviving documents. What remained was enough to establish the pattern, the methodology, and the institutional chain of authorization, which ran without interruption from the camp's SS medical staff through the Reich's research apparatus to the same regulatory and pharmaceutical bodies that were simultaneously managing the civilian prescription system and the military supply chain. These were not separate programs that happened to use the same molecule. They were connected. The knowledge generated at Sachsenhausen informed the dosing protocols that Wehrmacht medical officers were working from. The data crossed between institutions the way all wartime research data crossed, through official channels in properly formatted reports, reviewed by credentialed physicians who countersigned the pages. Now consider what this means for everything that came before. When Ranke wrote his 1939 memo recommending Pervitin for military use, he was working from Temler's civilian trial data. By 1942, the military's understanding of the drug's limits was no longer based solely on civilian trials. It was being supplemented by data generated from experiments on human beings who'd been given no choice and offered no protection, and that supplemented understanding was flowing back into the same system that was deciding how many tablets to put in a soldier's ration kit. The Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946-47 addressed human experimentation in the concentration camps across a wide range of programs. Several of the physicians involved in the broader SS medical research structure were tried and convicted. The Sachsenhausen endurance experiments appeared in the evidentiary record, but the specific chain of accountability connecting those experiments to Pervitin's pharmaceutical and military history, the institutional pathway through which the data moved from the camp to the research office to the supply chain, was not the focus of the prosecution's case. The convictions that resulted were for the acts of experimentation. Nobody was convicted specifically for Pervitin. Temler's executives, who had maintained a direct supply contract with the Wehrmacht throughout the war, and whose product was the subject of the Sachsenhausen trials, navigated the post-war legal landscape largely intact. The company's records from the war years were incomplete when Allied investigators requested them. Key personnel had moved. Documents had been lost in the bombing. The standard architecture of institutional forgetting had assembled itself with the efficiency that such architectures typically manage in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. What the Allies did recover, however, was the data, and here the story pivots in a direction that the standard history of Pervitin almost never includes, because what happened to the German amphetamine research after the war did not end with Nuremberg. It continued, under different flags. American military researchers, processing the captured Wehrmacht and SS medical documents in 1945 and 1946, found in them a detailed empirical record of what amphetamines could do to soldiers in sustained combat operations, data that no ethical trial could have generated and that no Allied military had produced independently. The United States military had used benzodrine during the war, informally and inconsistently. What the German documents provided was something more systematic: dosing protocols, tolerance timelines, performance metrics across extended sleep deprivation, and the outer limits of stimulant-enhanced endurance. This information was reviewed. It was assessed. It was not destroyed. American soldiers in Korea received amphetamines as part of standard military issue. The specific formulation had changed. The institutional knowledge informing the dosage protocols had not entirely started from scratch. British RAF pilots had used benzodrine during the Battle of Britain. That was already documented. What is less documented is the degree to which British military medical research in the late 1940s drew on the same captured German records that American researchers were processing simultaneously. The post-war intelligence sharing arrangements between Allied military research bodies were extensive and largely classified. The paper trail is incomplete. What is not incomplete is the outcome. Every major Western military maintained amphetamine programs through the 1950s, with the United States continuing documented military amphetamine distribution into the Vietnam era. The molecule had crossed the war. It had changed uniforms. It had kept moving. Gerhard Orzechowski, who had submitted his careful report in November 1943 and received a form letter in response, survived the war. He returned to civilian medical practice in West Germany in 1947. In 1951, a colleague showed him a document, a summary of the Sachsenhausen medical experiments that had been entered into the Nuremberg record and subsequently published in a German medical journal as part of the post-war accounting of SS medicine. Orzechowski read the document carefully. He recognized the methodology. He recognized the dosing structure. He recognized in the organized rows of data about endurance limits and physiological collapse the same questions his own 1943 report had been trying to answer from the other direction. Not how far the drug could push a human being, but how much damage it had already done. He understood, reading it, where his report had actually gone. He kept his copy of the journal. He didn't publish anything further on the subject. He continued his practice, treating patients in a mid-sized city in the Rhineland, and retired in 1968. His personal papers were donated to a regional archive after his death. The 1943 report was among them, his original carbon copy, the one he had kept before submitting the original. Across the top margin, in his small, controlled handwriting, he had written a single word at some point after the war. The word was Sachsenhausen. He had figured it out, he had written it down, and then he had put it in a box. Meanwhile, in the pharmaceutical offices of West Germany, something was happening that Orzechowski likely knew about but had no way to stop, because the companies producing methamphetamine-based products had not, in fact, stopped producing them. They had simply changed the packaging. Germany collapsed in May 1945, and the silence that followed was its own kind of shock. For 6 years, the entire architecture of daily life had been organized around the war's momentum, its demands, its rhythms, its chemical requirements. Now the momentum was gone. The factories stopped. The supply chains dissolved. The quartermasters' offices closed. And across Germany, in apartments and hospitals and the ruins of field stations, millions of people woke up on the morning after the surrender and reached for something that was no longer coming. The military Pervitin supply had simply ceased to exist. There was no tapering protocol, no medical supervision for the withdrawal, No acknowledgement from any official body that the soldiers returning from the Eastern Front, from France, from North Africa, from the collapsing interior of the Reich itself, had been maintained on a chemically addictive substance for years, and were now being asked to stop without assistance or explanation. The men walked home, those who could walk, and the drug that had kept them moving was gone, and the bodies that had been running on it for years had no idea what to do with the stillness. Heinrich Böll came back. He was 27 years old in 1945, and he had survived something that had killed a significant fraction of the men who went with him. He returned to Cologne, to a city that was approximately 40% rubble, to a family that was intact in its essential members if not its structure, and he began, in the way of a man who processes the world through language, to write. His first published stories appeared within a few years of the war's end, spare, precise narratives about ordinary Germans in extraordinary wreckage, the kind of writing that established him quickly as a significant voice in the literature of post-war Germany. What those early stories carried, without naming it, was the particular texture of a man reassembling himself after years of chemical alteration. The sleeplessness that had plagued the Eastern Front had followed him home. The ability to sustain extended concentration, present during Pervitin use, absent without it, returned slowly, incompletely, and not always reliably. Böll would later describe the years immediately after the war as a period of reconstruction that went deeper than the rubble outside his window. He did not, in his published work or public statements, identify Pervitin by name as part of that reconstruction. His letters to his parents, in which the request for tablets had appeared so casually, were not published during his lifetime. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1972. The prize committee cited his work's renewal of German literature and its capacity for compassion in depicting ordinary human beings under pressure. The letters requesting Pervitin from his mother were published by scholars decades after his death, and the critical reassessment of his work that followed, what it meant to read his war writing knowing the chemical state in which some of it was experienced, has never been completed to anyone's full satisfaction. Elsa Mertens did not emerge as cleanly. Karl did not come home. His last confirmed location was a POW camp in the Soviet Union, documented in a Red Cross record from late 1945. After that, nothing. The specific silence that fell over hundreds of thousands of German families waiting for a man who existed somewhere in the Soviet bureaucracy of captivity and would eventually either emerge or not. Elsa waited. She kept the apartment. She kept the boys in school. She kept taking Pervitin, because Karl's absence was not a condition that ended on a particular date, and the drug had become so thoroughly woven into her baseline functioning that the question of stopping it had no obvious answer. Her doctor retired in 1946. His replacement was younger, trained in the new post-war German medical culture that was trying, somewhat chaotically, to reconcile its recent history with its continuing obligations. He reviewed Elsa's prescription history at her first appointment, the dates, the escalating doses, the unbroken 4-year run, and arrived at a conclusion his predecessor had not reached. He told her the prescription was ending. He gave her a tapering schedule. He described in clinical terms what she should expect. She tried. She followed the schedule for 11 days. On the 12th day, she sent her younger son to the neighbour's apartment and did not open her door for the rest of the week. Her elder son, 13 years old, slid bread and a cup of water under the door each morning. He told his brother their mother was sick. He had no more specific explanation than that. She came out on the 7th day, thinner, her eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who has spent time in a place they don't intend to describe. She picked up the younger boy from the neighbour. She combed her hair. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at nothing in particular before beginning to make dinner. She did not go back to the new doctor. Across the city, across all of Germany's cities, versions of this scene were playing out in apartments, in veterans' facilities, in the rooms of people who had no medical supervision at all and were simply enduring what the body did when years of forced dopamine expenditure came due. The post-war German medical system had no category for this. There was no treatment infrastructure, no clinical protocol, no public acknowledgement that the state had chemically conditioned its civilian and military population and then withdrawn the chemical without a plan. The German government did not issue a public statement about Pervitin's wartime role in 1945, or 1946, or for decades afterward. Now look at Japan. The Japanese amphetamine crisis did not wait for the peace to make itself visible. It erupted through the surrender like a second disaster arriving on the heels of the first. The military stockpiles of Philipon that had been distributed to soldiers and factory workers were not destroyed when Japan surrendered in August 1945. They were released. Pharmaceutical companies, facing the collapse of their military contracts and the desperate economic conditions of occupied Japan, sold their remaining amphetamine stocks directly to the civilian market, where a traumatized, starving, and in many cases already chemically dependent population absorbed them with a speed that observers described as watching water disappear into dry ground. By 1948, Japanese health authorities estimated that 550,000 people were addicted to amphetamines, a number that represented roughly 1% of the entire national population and a far higher percentage of the urban working-age demographic. Street crime in Tokyo doubled between 1946 and 1950. Hospital psychiatric wards filled with cases of amphetamine psychosis that doctors, many of whom had no pre-war experience with stimulant addiction, struggled to recognize or treat. A generation of young Japanese men who had spent the war years on military-issued methamphetamine spent the post-war years trying to survive the absence of it, in an economy that had nothing to offer them and a medical system that had no framework for their condition. The Japanese government criminalized amphetamine possession in 1951. The epidemic continued for another decade. The direct pharmaceutical lineage from Japan's wartime Philipon program to Southeast Asia's modern methamphetamine crisis, the one currently producing hundreds of millions of Yaba tablets annually in Myanmar and distributing them across Thailand, Laos and Cambodia, runs without interruption. The chemistry is essentially unchanged. The distribution networks that emerge from post-war Japan's black market evolved, consolidated, and expanded along the same regional trade routes that had carried Philipon during the war. The molecule simply kept finding new markets. Back in West Germany, Temla Pharma had resumed operations. The company had survived the war, survived the Allied occupation, survived Nuremberg, and by the late 1940s was producing pharmaceutical products again in a reconstituted West German market, hungry for medical normalcy. Pervitin itself remained nominally available by prescription through the late 1950s in West Germany, no longer over-the-counter, no longer marketed with the confidence of the pre-war campaigns, but present, listed in pharmaceutical catalogues, dispensed by physicians who had trained under the system that had created it and had not been given a compelling reason to stop. But Temla was not the only actor in this space. Several West German pharmaceutical companies, operating in the permissive regulatory environment of a country rebuilding its institutions from scratch, introduced methamphetamine-based compounds under new names and new therapeutic framings in the late 1940s and 1950s. The new framing was weight loss. The post-war consumer in West Germany was, for complex economic and psychological reasons, strongly motivated toward thinness and the appetite-suppressing properties of methamphetamine-class drugs one of the most reliable secondary effects of the drug's action on the brain, were precisely what the market wanted. The pill was the same, the box was different. The box said, diet aid. This was not a uniquely German phenomenon. In the United States, Smith, Kline and French's amphetamine products were prescribed to an estimated 3 million Americans per year by 1952, predominantly for weight loss and depression. The American Medical Association had endorsed amphetamine-based diet pills as medically appropriate. Women's magazines ran articles about the new compounds that used language strikingly similar to Temler's 1938 promotional literature: effective, safe, non-habit forming. The specific molecule had shifted slightly in some products, from methamphetamine to amphetamine sulfate or dextroamphetamine, but the mechanism was identical and the dependency profile was the same. The World Health Organization issued its first formal warning on amphetamine-class drugs in 1956, noting accumulating evidence of dependency, psychosis, and cardiovascular harm across multiple countries. The warning was noted in medical literature. It was not reflected in prescription rates, which continued to climb through the late 1950s in West Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Orzechowski, in his Rhineland practice, was seeing the post-war version of what he had documented during the war. Patients presenting with the same withdrawal pattern, the same dependency trajectory, the same gradual erosion of the capacity to function without the drug, only now the drug came in a box that said it was for weight loss, and the patients were housewives rather than soldiers, and the doctors prescribing it had no idea they were repeating a cycle that had already run once, at industrial scale, and produced a result they were currently living inside the aftermath of. He had the data. He had the report. He had the single word written in the margin. He had patients sitting across his desk who needed help. He was not certain the medical system knew how to provide. And in a Berlin pharmaceutical archive, in a filing cabinet that had survived the bombing because it was in the basement, the original Temler trial data from 1937 sat in its folders, the clean, careful, methodologically sound documentation of a drug that had seemed, at the time, like nothing more than a solution to a very ordinary human problem. The folders were not labelled with anything alarming. They were labelled with dates and batch numbers, the administrative language of science. The molecule they described was, at that moment, being synthesized in at least 6 countries simultaneously, in pharmaceutical factories, in military laboratories, and in the first of what would become, over the following decades, a vast and ungovernable network of illegal production facilities that no government had yet conceived of, and no law had yet been written to address. The war was over. The drug had not noticed. The molecule didn't change. The world around it did. Laws, names, packaging, justifications. But the chemistry that Friedrich Hauschild had refined in his Berlin laboratory remained essentially constant across the decades that followed. What changed was the story told about it, and who was telling it, and what they needed the story to accomplish at any given moment. In the 1960s, the story was that amphetamines were a medical problem, not a social one. Individual patients making individual choices, manageable within the existing healthcare framework. Prescription rates in the United States peaked in 1969 at approximately 8 billion amphetamine tablets, produced annually for a country of 200 million people. The arithmetic of that number, roughly 40 tablets per American per year, including infants and the elderly, did not produce the response it should have produced. It produced instead a slow, regulatory tightening that took most of the decade to complete and left significant gaps through which the pharmaceutical use of amphetamine-class drugs continued largely uninterrupted. The Controlled Substances Act in the United States in 1970 finally placed amphetamines in a restricted category. West Germany followed with comparable legislation in 1971. These were real changes. They genuinely reduced the volume of pharmaceutical amphetamine moving through legal channels, and they did so relatively quickly once implemented. The prescription rates dropped. The legal production numbers fell. Anyone watching only the pharmaceutical data would have seen, by the mid-1970s, something that looked like a solved problem. The illegal production had already begun. The synthesis of methamphetamine is not technically complex. It does not require specialized equipment or advanced training. It requires specific precursor chemicals, basic laboratory apparatus, and the knowledge of a procedure that exists in published scientific literature dating back to 1919. When legal pharmaceutical supplies contracted in the 1970s, the demand did not contract with them. It redirected. Motorcycle gangs in California had been cooking methamphetamine in improvised laboratories since the mid-1960s, not because they had access to the German wartime research or the Temla synthesis protocols, but because the same molecule that Hauschild had patented in 1937 was derivable from sources available at a hardware store and a farm supply depot. The market found its own supply chain. It always does. Elsa Mertens lived to see none of this in its full shape, and all of it in its essential outline. Carl never came home. The Red Cross record from 1945 was the last documentation of his existence. After that, nothing, which in the context of Soviet POW camps meant something specific and permanent that Elsa understood without receiving official confirmation until 1952. When a German government notification arrived in an envelope she'd been expecting for 7 years. She read it at the kitchen table. She folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept the household documents. She made dinner. She'd rebuilt a functional life by the time that letter arrived. Not the life she had before the war, not the self that had existed before 1940, but a workable structure built on different foundations. The Pervitin was gone. Genuinely gone, by 1949, eliminated through a process that had taken nearly 3 years and no formal medical assistance, navigated through sheer necessity and the practical understanding that there was simply no longer a reliable source and therefore no alternative to stopping. What the process had cost her was not visible to anyone outside the apartment. What it had left behind was visible only in certain small specifics. The way she sat very still on some evenings, not reading, not listening to the radio, just sitting. The slight hesitation before she answered questions that required emotional assessment, not confusion, something more like the extra beat of a person accessing a mechanism that had been impaired and partially repaired and was not quite as fast as it once was. Her younger son, grown by then, noticed it without being able to name it. Her elder son had stopped trying to name things he couldn't explain by the time he was 15. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small import firm in the early 1950s. She was precise, reliable, and never late. She retired in 1974. She died in 1981 at 75 of a cardiac event in the apartment she'd lived in since before the war. Her younger son found her in the chair by the window, the one that faced east toward where the morning light came in. He cleared the apartment over the following weeks. In the bathroom cabinet, behind a row of ordinary medicines, aspirin, throat lozenges, a nearly empty bottle of cough syrup, he found a small brown glass bottle with a faded label, the paper brittle and yellowed, the text barely legible. He didn't recognize the name on the label. He put the bottle in the box he was taking to the rubbish. He never looked it up. The medicine that modern militaries eventually adopted as the replacement for amphetamines was called modafinil, a wakefulness-promoting agent with a different mechanism of action, significantly lower abuse potential, and a cleaner safety profile than anything in the methamphetamine family. The United States Air Force approved it for pilot use in 2003. The French Foreign Legion had been using it since the 1990s. The British military authorised it for certain operations following the same period. The official rationale in each case was identical: operational necessity, temporary use, controlled dosing, medical supervision. The official rationale was familiar. Modafinil is not methamphetamine. The distinction is real and matters medically. But the institutional logic that produced its military adoption, the calculation that a soldier's biological need for sleep is a tactical liability that chemistry can and should address, is the same logic that Otto Ranke applied to his 1939 memo, using different words and a different compound. The conclusion travels, the molecule changes, the reasoning stays. Desoxin, pharmaceutical methamphetamine hydrochloride, remains a legally approved prescription medication in the United States today, indicated for ADHD and short-term treatment of obesity. Its DEA schedule makes it difficult to prescribe, and it is rarely used when alternatives exist. But it exists. It is manufactured. It sits in formularies. A physician with a prescription pad can, in 2024, prescribe the direct pharmaceutical descendant of the exact compound that Temla Pharma produced in its Berlin factory in 1940 and distributed to soldiers in the Ardennes. The box looks different. The molecule does not. What medicine genuinely learned from the Pervitin story arrived slowly and incompletely, through the same iterative process that all medical knowledge follows: observation, pattern recognition, resistance from commercial and institutional interests, eventual consensus, partial implementation. The modern understanding of dopamine receptor downregulation, the mechanism by which chronic stimulant use physically restructures the brain's reward system, requiring the drug simply to feel normal, owes a measurable debt to the data produced by the first generation of methamphetamine users, among whom German civilians and soldiers of the 1938 to 1945 period represent the largest single cohort in history. The neuroscience built on that population's suffering now underpins treatment protocols for stimulant use disorder worldwide. The irony of that is not lost on the researchers who work in the field. Most of them know the history. They cite different papers, use different terminology, and work in a clinical tradition that has formally renounced the methods that generated the foundational data. The knowledge and its origins coexist in the literature without any obvious point of resolution. Gerhard Orzechowski retired from medicine in 1968. His papers went to a regional archive in the Rhineland following his death in 1979. The archive catalogued them in 1984, his patient records, correspondence, and professional documents, including the carbon copy of his 1943 report. A German medical historian found the report in 1997 while researching wartime Wehrmacht medicine and published a paper referencing it in 2001. The paper received moderate attention in specialist circles. The word Sachsenhausen, written in the margin, was noted. It was not followed further in that particular paper. The Temla factory building in Berlin was converted to other uses after the war and eventually demolished. A residential development now occupies the site. The people who live there do not know what was manufactured on that ground. There is no plaque. Friedrich Hauschild, whose synthesis of Pervitin in 1937 began the chain of events that runs through this entire story, continued working in pharmaceutical chemistry after the war. He held several patents in other areas. He died in 1975. His obituary in a German pharmaceutical journal described him as a careful and productive scientist who had made significant contributions to his field. Pervitin was mentioned in one sentence, in the past tense, as one compound among several he had developed. The methamphetamine epidemic that the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime currently tracks spans every inhabited continent. Annual seizures of the drug exceed 200 metric tons, a figure that represents a fraction of total production, since interdiction rates for methamphetamine are estimated at somewhere between 10 and 15% of supply. The primary production centres have shifted. Myanmar's Shan state now produces quantities that make the Temla factory's wartime output look negligible, but the synthesis routes still trace back to the same basic chemistry that was available in Japanese and German laboratories in the 1910s. Every generation since 1938 has encountered the molecule under a different name, in a different form, authorized by different institutions for different stated purposes, and has arrived at the same destination. The question that the accumulated evidence of 80 years keeps generating, why each new encounter with this compound produces the same institutional failure to act on available warning signs, does not have a clean answer in the medical literature, the regulatory history, or the military records. The data exists, the pattern is legible, the decisions get made anyway. The why of that is not a chemistry question. And somewhere in that gap between the data and the decision, in the space where a procurement order gets signed despite a warning report, where a prescription gets written despite a pattern of escalating use, where a supply chain gets built despite evidence of cardiac deaths, the story of Pervitin is still running. It didn't end in 1945. It didn't end with the Controlled Substances Act, or the WHO warning, or the Nuremberg record, or the retirement of the last physician who had prescribed it under its original name. It was running when Elsa's son put that brown bottle in the rubbish box without looking up the name on the label. It is running now. Go back to the Ardennes, May 10th, 1940. The same forest, the same armoured columns threading through the trees in the dark, the same soldiers who haven't slept, the same French commanders watching their maps and waiting for a pause that doesn't come. The scene looks identical to the one that opened this story. But the viewer standing at the edge of that forest now sees something completely different from what they saw 2 hours ago. They see a factory in Berlin running 3 shifts. They see Otto Ranker's memo, the 11 pages, the one sentence about 3 to 4 days without sleep, and the qualifications after it that nobody read. They see Friedrich Hauschild's laboratory notebooks, the careful handwriting, the clinical trial data that showed reduced hesitation as a positive result. They see 35 million tablets moving through a quartermaster's supply chain with the administrative normalcy of bread and ammunition. They see the second notebook with 14 names. They see Conti's report sitting on a general's desk, read and set aside. And they see, in the cab of one of those Panzer vehicles moving through the Ardennes at 3 a.m, a young man who is not afraid and does not know why he is not afraid, who believes, because the pill has made believing this chemically inevitable, that he is simply brave, that this is simply what he is, that the clarity and the forward momentum and the absolute absence of the hesitation that should be telling him to stop are his own. He is 22 years old. He has taken his tablet. He will not understand what that tablet was for another 4 years, and by then the understanding will arrive in the specific form that most truths about the body arrive. Not as information, but as damage. The blitzkrieg lasted 46 days. The dependency it created lasted decades. The military historians who documented the campaign filled thousands of pages with analysis of its tactical brilliance, the audacity of the Ardennes route, the paralysis of French command, the coordination of air and armour that no previous military had achieved at that scale. All of that analysis is accurate. All of it is also incomplete in the same way. It describes what the soldiers did without fully accounting for the biochemical state in which they did it. Speed was the doctrine. Chemistry was the engine. Now consider a number that doesn't appear in most histories of the Second World War. Between 1938 and 1945, the German military and civilian population consumed an estimated 200 million doses of Pervitin. 200 million, in a country of 80 million people. That is not a program at the margins of a society. That is a pharmacological event running through the centre of it, touching the soldier in the Ardennes and the housewife in Prenzlauer Berg, and the student at the University of Munich, and the factory worker on the night shift in the Ruhr, all of them swallowing the same molecule, all of them told it was medicine, all of them finding out otherwise on their own timeline and in their own private way. The people who made that decision, who moved the molecule from Hauschild's laboratory to Temmler's production line, to the pharmacy shelf to the army's supply chain, did not think of themselves as conducting an experiment on their own population. That is the precise detail that makes the story impossible to resolve cleanly. They thought they were solving a problem. The problem was real. The solution worked, for a while, in exactly the way promised. And then it kept working differently, for much longer than anyone had planned, in directions no promotional pamphlet had described. Elsa's younger son was 73 when he cleared her apartment in 1981. He had lived a complete life by then, a career, a family, a city rebuilt around him from the rubble he had grown up inside. He had no memory of his mother taking any particular medication. He remembered her as competent, contained, occasionally distant in the afternoons, a woman who sat very still sometimes by the east-facing window. He did not connect these things to anything chemical. Why would he? The connection had never been offered to him. He put the brown bottle in the rubbish box. He carried the box to the building's courtyard. The bottle went into the bin. It had no label he could read. It had a residue at the bottom, dried to a faint white crust. The last traces of a compound synthesized in Berlin in 1937, tested on students in 1939, distributed to soldiers in 1940, prescribed to housewives in the same year, studied on prisoners in 1942, carried across the war, renamed, reformulated, distributed again under different flags to different soldiers in different wars, compressed into different pills in different countries with different names on the box. The bottle is gone. The molecule is not. Right now, methamphetamine is the second most widely consumed illegal drug on the planet. More than 50 million people use it regularly. The synthesis at the centre of its production, the core chemical reaction, has not fundamentally changed since Akira Ogata refined it in 1919. The same reaction that Friedrich Hauschild used in his Berlin laboratory. The same reaction that produced the pill in Elsa's cabinet. The same reaction running tonight in production facilities across Myanmar, Mexico, and a dozen other countries, at a scale that makes the Temmler factory's wartime output look like a pilot program. The soldiers in the Ardennes thought they were moving through history. They were, just not only in the direction they believed. The question that remains, the one this story cannot close because no story can, is not about the molecule. Chemists understand the molecule. Neuroscientists understand what it does to the brain. Epidemiologists understand how the addiction spreads. The question that remains is the one embedded in every procurement order, every prescription, every promotional pamphlet, every general who read a warning report and sign the supply authorization anyway. The question is not what the drug does. The question is what a person, an institution, a government, a military, a pharmaceutical company, is willing to know, and when, and what they do with the knowing. That question was open in Berlin in 1937. It is open now.